The process of reconstructing the Oath of the Horatii in 3D consisted of 5 production areas in which inquiry and curiosities arose and helped me discover elements of the painting I had not noticed before. This video will guide you on how the experience occurred. Interpreting space. To translate 2D illusory space into 3D, I needed some units of reference. Thanks to Photoshop, I was able to measure the dimensions of the painting's implied space in each axis. I used a tool called Vanishing Point Filter, which allows me to draw grid planes that align with the linear perspective of the painting. I can pull out a plane that intersects with a male figure and with the measure tool, assign his height around 2 meters. Once I extrapolate the grids, I have a sort of room representing the boundaries of the implied space, with units based off the average height of the man. Using the same process, I can match grid planes with elements in the painting and find the distance between. You can see here an example of measuring between the walls and then measuring the depth of the space. These measurements gave me a great place to start with the 3D space. But most importantly, they revealed the true dimensions of a space that is currently only under estimation. This step informed me about the true size of the space, which I discovered was more deep than wide, something I couldn't get from basic visual analysis. Translating space. Based on the measurements, I began to block in basic geometry. This was more or less a technical part of the process, using tools in Maya like polygon primitives and the distance measuring tool to make sure my objects were in the right dimensions and locations. I put in basic T-pose male figures at 2 meters tall so that everything was in proportion to my measurements, and then compared the human figure with the space. I found myself stuck between the correctly translated space based on measuring and the feel of the space based on visual analysis. I started introducing the Oculus Rift in this step. I would create different iterations of the space and walk around in virtual reality to view them. This part of the process contrasted with the previous step. While measuring this space made me more aware of the actual dimensions, translating it made me more aware of its feeling and illusion purely from a visual aspect. I ended up finding a compromise that closely followed the measurements, but still allowed for the feeling of the space to come through. Poses. To save time, I use Autodesk Character Generator, which allowed me to download a fully modeled and rigged human which I can manipulate and pose like a puppet. They are, as far as I know, in correct human proportions. Using these pre-rigged bodies, I began to pose the male figures simply by matching them with the pose depicted in the painting. It was difficult at times to gauge depth since it was mostly a profile comparison. I started to notice some of the elements of the pose simply could not be captured. The first instance was the middle male's arm grasping the front male. The model's arm was not long enough to wrap around where it reaches the middle of the back like in the painting. In order for him to be able to, his thigh had to intersect with the other male. This raised some questions about the proportions of the figures in the painting. Upon further investigation, I found out the front male's arm is longer than normal in the painting, as you can see here. It almost reaches his knee compared to the model reaching his thigh. You can see some trouble here posing the front female, especially with her arm. I further investigated proportions with Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man using the Photoshop method, measuring him and setting his height at 2 meters and then measuring his arm. I found out the female's arm is actually longer than a 6-foot male's arm. Lastly, the furthest female with the child cannot be seated on the bench correctly in her pose. This step made me greatly question the proportions of figures in the painting as well as the relationship with the space around them. It was something only the 3D medium provided. Lighting. The real-time light changes in a 3D program enable me to see instant effects from changes to light sources. I use hints from the painting like the shadow direction and the casted lines to inform me on lighting aspects like direction, intensity, and the number of light sources. I also use hints like the shadows across the pillars to get a better idea of unseen elements in the painting, like depth, where a window might be, and the height of the ceiling. After trial and error, I found that the lighting depicted in the painting is physically impossible. No lighting setup or space could satisfy both the direction of the light implied by the figure's cast shadow and the location and angle of the cast shadows on the pillars. One of these elements was always compromised. I figured this out by creating different iterations of the space and making changes that I had experimented with before. As you can see, even with all possible windows in one form, no matter where I point the light, I just cannot get the same effect as in the painting. Either the figure's cast shadow is not lined up, or the shadow across the pillars is not there. This part of the process greatly encouraged me to look deeper into lighting and the ways and reasons it might be manipulated. I will admit that I was fooled by the light and never questioned its authenticity until I explored in the 3D medium. Optics. I wanted to match up the view of the 3D scene to represent the flat image from that specific perspective in the painting. After aligning the camera, I got frustrated because there was always some part of my scene that seemed off. You can see here in the arches and the depth of where the arches are. However, I began to change the angle of view attribute of the camera, which functions like a lens millimeter value. This changes how much depth is in the scene, as you can see here. A low value has almost no depth, while a high value makes the scene seem very, very deep. I ended up having to increase the value slightly past default and move the camera a little closer, which was a surprise because I always thought the painting had shallow space. You can see now how closely the wire mesh of the scene matches up with the image, nearly perfectly. Overall, the process of making with digital tools informed me on the painting in many unexpected ways. The role of the artifact was able to shift from generating questions to a tool that allowed me to investigate those questions. It has amazing potential when it comes to our understanding of the construction of complex visuals and the way we create meaning from them.